Hi, sleepless brothers and sisters. Here comes your favorite doctor, the best one to gently put you to sleep. So get comfortable, relax, turn off the lights in your room, and slow down that fan just enough to feel the silence. Let the world fade away as you enjoy the soft whispers of history. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for your daily dose of sleeping history. Scott used to say that the worst part of an expedition was over when the preparation was finished. So no doubt it was with a sigh of relief that he saw the Terra Nova out from Cardiff into the Atlantic on June 15, 1910. Cardiff had given the expedition a most generous and enthusiastic send-off, and Scott announced that it should be his first port on returning to England. Just 3 years more, and the Terra Nova, worked back from New Zealand by Pennell, reached Cardiff again on June 14, 1913, and paid off there. From the first, everything was informal and most pleasant, and those who had the good fortune to help in working the ship out to New Zealand, under steam or sail, must, in spite of 5 months of considerable discomfort and very hard work, look back upon the voyage as one of the very happiest times of the expedition. To some of us, perhaps, the voyage out, the 3 weeks in the pack ice going south, and the Robinson Crusoe life at Hut Point are the pleasantest of many happy memories. Scott made a great point that so far as was possible, the personnel of the expedition must go out with the Terra Nova. Possibly he gave instructions that they were to be worked hard, and no doubt it was a good opportunity of testing our mettle. We had been chosen out of 8,000 volunteers, executive officers, scientific staff, crew, and all. We differed entirely from the crew of an ordinary merchant ship, both in our personnel and in our methods of working. The executive officers were drawn from the Navy, as were also the crew. In addition, there was the scientific staff, including one doctor who was not a naval surgeon, but who was also a scientist, and 2 others called by Scott adaptable helpers, namely Oates and myself. The scientific staff of the expedition numbered 12 members all told, but only 6 were on board. The remainder were to join the ship at Lyttelton, New Zealand, when we made our final embarkation for the south. Of those on the ship, Wilson was chief of the scientific staff, and united in himself the various functions of vertebral zoologist, doctor, artist, and, as this book will soon show, the unfailing friend in need of all on board. Lieutenant Evans was in command, with Campbell as first officer. Watches were of course assigned immediately to the executive officers. The crew was divided into a port and starboard watch, and the ordinary routine of a sailing ship with auxiliary steam was followed. Beyond this, no work was definitely assigned to any individual on board. How the custom of the ship arose I do not know, but in effect most things were done by volunteer labor. It was recognized that everyone whose work allowed turned to immediately on any job which was wanted, but it was an absolutely voluntary duty. Volunteers to shorten sail, to coal, to shift cargo, to pump, to paint or wash down paintwork. They were constant calls, some of them almost hourly calls, day and night, and there was never any failure to respond fully. This applied not only to the scientific staff, but also, whenever their regular duties allowed, to the executive officers. There wasn't an officer on the ship who did not shift coal till he was sick of the sight of it, but I heard no complaints. Such a system soon singles out the real willing workers, but it is apt to put an undue strain upon them. Meanwhile, most of the executive officers as well as the scientific staff had their own work to do, which they were left to fit in as most convenient. The first days out from England were spent in such hard and crowded work that we shook down very quickly. I then noticed for the first time Wilson's great gift of tact, and how quick he was to see the small things which make so much difference. At the same time, his passion for work set a high standard. Pennell was another glutton. We dropped anchor in Funchal Harbor, Madeira, about 4 p.m. on June 23rd, 8 days out. The ship had already been running under sail and steam. The decks were as clear as possible. There was some paintwork to show, and with a good harbor stow, she looked thoroughly workmanlike and neat. Some scientific work, in particular tow netting and magnetic observations, had already been done. But even as early as this, we had spent hours on the pumps, and it was evident that these pumps were going to be a constant nightmare. In Madeira, as everywhere, we were given freely of such things as we required. We left in the early morning of June 26th, after Pennell had done some hours' magnetic work with the Lloyd Creek and Barrow Dip Circle. On June 29th, noon position lat 27-10N, long 20-21W, it was possible to write, "A fortnight out today," and from the general appearance of the wardroom, we might have been out a year. We were to a great extent strangers to one another when we left England, but officers and crew settled down to their jobs quickly, and when men live as close as we did, they settle down or quarrel before very long. Let us walk into the cabins which surround the small wardroom aft. The first on the left is that of Scott and Lieutenant Evans, but Scott is not on board, and Wilson has taken his place. In the next cabin to them is Drake, the secretary. On the starboard side of the screw are Oates, Atkinson, and Levick, the two latter being doctors, and on the port side Campbell and Pennell, who is navigator, then Rennick and Bowers, the latter just home from the Persian Gulf. Both of these are watchkeepers. In the next cabin are Simpson, meteorologist, back from Simla, with Nelson and Lilly, marine biologists. In the last cabin, the nursery, are the youngest, and necessarily the best behaved, of this community. Wright, the physicist and chemist, Gran, the Norwegian ski expert, and myself, Wilson's helper and assistant zoologist. It is difficult to put a man down as performing any special job where each did so many, but that is roughly what we were. Certain men already began to stand out. Wilson, with an apparently inexhaustible stock of knowledge on little things and big, always ready to give help, and always ready with sympathy and insight, a tremendous worker, and as unselfish as possible, a universal advisor. Pennell, as happy as the day was long, working out sights, taking his watch on the bridge, or if not on watch, full of energy aloft, trimming coal, or any other job that came along, withal spending hours a day on magnetic work, which he did as a hobby and not in any way as his job. Bowers was proving himself the best seaman on board, with an exact knowledge of the whereabouts and contents of every case, box, and bale, and with a supreme contempt for heat or cold. Simpson was obviously a first-class scientist, devoted to his work, in which Wright gave him very great and unselfish help, while at the same time doing much of the ship's work. Oates and Atkinson generally worked together in a solid, dependable, and somewhat humorous way. Evans, who will always be called Lieutenant Evans in this book to distinguish him from Seaman Evans, was in charge of the ship, and did much to cement together the rough material into a nucleus which was capable of standing without any friction the strains of nearly 3 years of crowded, isolated, and difficult life, ably seconded by Victor Campbell, first officer, commonly called the mate, in whose hands the routine and discipline of the ship was most efficiently maintained. I was very frightened of Campbell. Scott himself was unable to travel all the way out to New Zealand in the Terra Nova, owing to the business affairs of the expedition, but he joined the ship from Simon's Bay to Melbourne. The voyage itself on the sailing track from Madeira to the Cape was at first uneventful. We soon got into hot weather, and at night, every available bit of deck space was used on which to sleep. The more particular slung hammocks, but generally men used such deck space as they could find, such as the top of the ice house, where they were free from the running tackle and rolled themselves into their blankets. So long as we had a wind, we ran under sail alone, and on those days men would bathe over the side in the morning. But when the engines were going, we could get the hose in the morning, which was preferred, especially after a shark was seen making for Bauer's red breast as he swam. The scene on deck in the early morning was always interesting. All hands were roused before 6 and turned on to the pumps, for the ship was leaking considerably. Normally, the well showed about 10 inches of water when the ship was dry. Before pumping, the sinker would show anything over 2 feet. The ship was generally dry after an hour to an hour and a half's pumping, and by that time we had had quite enough of it. As soon as the officer of the watch had given the order, "Vast pumping," the first thing to do was to strip, and the deck was dotted with men trying to get the maximum amount of water from the sea in a small bucket let down on a line from the moving ship. First efforts in this direction would have been amusing had it not been for the caustic eye of the mate on the bridge. If the reader ever gets the chance to try the experiment, especially in a swell, he will soon find himself with neither bucket nor water. The poor mate was annoyed by the loss of his buckets. Everybody was working very hard during these days, shifting coal, reefing and furling sail aloft, hauling on the ropes on deck, together with magnetic and meteorological observations, tow netting, collecting and making skins, and so forth. During the first weeks there was more cargo stowing and paintwork than at other times. Otherwise the work ran in very much the same lines all the way out, a period of nearly 5 months. On July 1st, we were overhauled by the only ship we ever saw, so far as I can remember, during all that time, the Inverclyde, a bark out from Glasgow to Buenos Aires. It was an oily, calm day with a sea like glass, and she looked, as Wilson quoted, like a painted ship upon a painted ocean as she lay with all sail set. We picked up the NE trade 2 days later, being then north of the Cape Verde Islands, lat. Tringy Sector 28N, long 2035W at noon. It was a Sunday, and there was a general make and mend throughout the ship, the first since we sailed. During the day, we ran from deep clear blue water into a darkish and thick green sea. This remarkable change of color, which was observed by the Discovery expedition in much the same place, was supposed to be due to a large mass of pelagic fauna called plankton. The plankton, which drifts upon the surface of the sea, is distinct from the nekton, which swims submerged. The Terra Nova was fitted with tow nets with very fine meshes for collecting these inhabitants of the open sea, together with the algae or minute plant organisms which afford them an abundant food supply. The plankton nets can be lowered when the ship is running at full speed, and a great many such hauls were made during the expedition. July 5th had an unpleasant surprise in store. At 10:30 a.m., the ship's bell rang and there was a sudden cry of "Fire quarters." 2 Minimax fire extinguishers finished the fire, which was in the lazarette, and was caused by a lighted lamp which was upset by the roll of the ship. The result was a good deal of smoke, a certain amount of water below, and some singed paper, but we realized that a fire on such an old wooden ship would be a very serious matter, and greater care was taken after this. Such a voyage shows nature in her most attractive form, and always there was a man close by whose special knowledge was in the whales, porpoises, dolphins, fish, birds, parasites, plankton, radium, and other things which we watched through microscopes or field glasses. Nelson caught a Portuguese man-of-war, Arethusa, as it sailed past us close under the counter. These animals are common, but few can realize how beautiful they are until they see them, fresh-colored from the deep sea, floating and sailing in a big glass bowl. It vainly tried to sail out, and vigorously tried to sting all who touched it. Wilson painted it. From first to last, the study of life of all kinds was of absorbing interest to all on board. And, when we landed in the Antarctic, as well as on the ship, everybody worked and was genuinely interested in all that lived and had its being on the fringe of that great sterile continent. Not only did officers who had no direct interest in anything but their own particular work or scientific subject spend a large part of their time in helping, making notes, and keeping observations, but the seamen also had a large share in the specimens and data of all descriptions which have been brought back. Several of them became good pupils for skinning birds. Meanwhile, perhaps the constant cries of whale, whale, or new bird, or dolphins sometimes found the biologist concerned less eager to leave his meal than the observers were to call him forth. Good opportunities of studying the life of seabirds, whales, dolphins, and other forms of life in the sea, even those comparatively few forms which are visible from the surface, are not too common. A modern liner moves so quickly that it does not attract life to it in the same way as a slow-moving ship like the Terra Nova, and when specimens are seen, they are gone almost as soon as they are observed. Those who wish to study sea life, and there is much to be done in this field, should travel by tramp steamers, or better still, sailing vessels. Dolphins were constantly playing under the bows of the ship, giving a very good chance for identification, and whales were also frequently sighted, and would sometimes follow the ship, as did also hundreds of seabirds, petrels, shearwaters, and albatross. It says much for the interest and keenness of the officers on board that a complete hourly log was kept from beginning to end of the numbers and species which were seen, generally with the most complete notes as to any peculiarity or habit which was noticed. It is to be hoped that full use will be made by those in charge of the working out of these results, of these logs which were kept so thoroughly and sometimes under such difficult circumstances and conditions of weather and sea. Though many helped, this log was largely the work of Pennell, who was an untiring and exact observer. We lost the NE trade about July 7th and ran into the doldrums. On the whole, we could not complain of the weather. We never had a gale or big sea until after leaving South Trinidad, and though an old ship with no modern ventilation is bound to be stuffy in the tropics, we lived and slept on deck so long as it was not raining. If it rained at night, as it frequently does in this part of the world, a number of rolled-up forms could be heard discussing as to whether it was best to stick it above or face the heat below. And if the rain persisted, sleepy and somewhat snappy individuals were to be seen trying to force themselves and a maximum amount of damp bedding down the wardroom gangway. At the same time, a thick wooden ship will keep fairly cool in the not severe heat through which we passed. One want which was unavoidable was the lack of fresh water. There was none to wash in, though a glass of water was allowed for shaving. With an unlimited amount of seawater, this may not seem much of a hardship, nor is it unless you have very dirty work to do. But inasmuch as some of the officers were coaling almost daily, they found that any amount of cold seawater, even with a euphemistically named seawater soap, had no very great effect in removing the coal dust. The alternative was to make friends with the engine room authorities and draw some water from the boilers. Perhaps, therefore, it was not with purely disinterested motives that some of us undertook to do the stoking during the morning watch, and also later in the day during our passage through the tropics, since the engine room staff was reduced by sickness. A very short time will convince anybody that the ease with which men accustomed to this work get through their watch is mainly due to custom and method. The ship had no forced draft nor modern ventilating apparatus. 4 hours in the boiling fiery furnace which the Terra Nova's stokehold formed in the tropics, unless there was a good wind to blow down the one canvas shaft, was a real test of staying power, and the actual shoveling of the coal into the furnaces, one after the other, was as child's play to handling the devil as the weighty instrument used for breaking up the clinker and shaping the fire was called. The boilers were cylindrical marine or return tube boilers, the furnaces being 6 feet long by 3 feet wide, slightly lower at the back than at the front. The fire on the bars was kept wedge shape, that is, some 9 inches high at the back, tapering to about 6 inches in front against the furnace doors. The furnaces were corrugated for strength. We were supposed to keep the pressure on the gauge between 70 and 80, but it wanted some doing. For the most part, it was done. We did, however, get uncomfortable days with the rain sluicing down and a high temperature, everything wet on deck and below, but it had its advantages in the fresh water it produced. Every bucket was on duty, and the ship's company stripped naked and ran about the decks or sat in the stream between the laboratories and wardroom skylight and washed their very dirty clothes. The stream came through into our bunks, and no amount of caulking ever stopped it. To sleep with a constant drip of water falling upon you is a real trial. These hot, wet days were more trying to the nerves than the months of wet, rough but cooler weather to come, and it says much for the good spirit which prevailed that there was no friction, though we were crowded together like sardines in a tin. July 12th was a typical day, lat. Fortig 57N, long 20 sector 4W. A very hot, rainy night, followed by a squall which struck us while we were having breakfast, so we went up and set all sail, which took until about 9:30 a.m. We then sat in the water on the deck and washed clothes until just before midday, when the wind dropped, though the rain continued. So we went up and furled all sail, a tedious business when the sails are wet and heavy, then work on cargo or coal till 7 p.m., supper, and glad to get to sleep. On July 15th, Latern 040 EN, long 20 Ferning 56, W. We crossed the line with all pomp and ceremony. At 1:15 p.m., Neptune in the person of Seaman Evans hailed and stopped the ship. He came on board with his motley company, who solemnly paced aft to the break of the poop, where he was met by Lieutenant Evans. His wife, Browning, a doctor, Peyton, Barber, Cheatham, 2 policemen, and 4 bears, of whom Atkinson and Oates were 2, grouped themselves round him while the barrister, Abbott, read an address to the captain, and then the procession moved round to the bath, a sail full of water slung in the break of the poop on the starboard side. Nelson was the first victim. He was examined, then overhauled by the doctor, given a pill and a dose, and handed over to the barber, who lathered him with a black mixture consisting of soot, flour, and water, was shaved by Cheatham with a great wooden razor, and then the policeman tipped him backwards into the bath where the bears were waiting. As he was being pushed in, he seized the barber and took him with him. Wright, Lilly, Simpson, and Levick followed, with about 6 of the crew. Finally, Gran, the Norwegian, was caught as an extra, never having been across the line in a British ship, but he threw the pill-distributing doctor over his head into the bath, after which he was lathered very gingerly, and Cheatham, having been in once, refused to shave him at all, so they tipped him in and wished they had never caught him. The procession reformed, and Neptune presented certificates to those who had been initiated. The proceedings closed with a sing-song in the evening. These sing-songs were a very frequent occurrence. The expedition was very fond of singing, though there was hardly anybody in it who could sing. The usual custom at this time was that everyone had to contribute a song in turn all round the table after supper. If he could not sing, he had to compose a limerick. If he could not compose a limerick, he had to contribute a fine towards the wine fund, which was to make some much-discussed purchases when we reached Cape Town. At other times we played the most childish games. There was one called "The Priest of the Parish Has Lost His Cap," over which we laughed till we cried, and much money was added to the wine fund. As always happens, certain songs became conspicuous for a time. One of these I am sure that Campbell, who was always at work and upon whom the routine of the ship depended, will never forget. I do not know who it was that started singing, but Campbell, who was the only father on board and whose hair was popularly supposed to be getting thin on the top of his head, may remember. We began to make preparations for a run ashore, a real adventure on an uninhabited and unknown island. The sailing track of ships from England round the Cape of Good Hope lies out towards the coast of Brazil, and not far from the mysterious island of South Trinidad, 680 miles east of Brazil, in 20°30 S and 29°30 W. This island is difficult of access, owing to its steep rocky coast and the big Atlantic swell which seldom ceases. It has therefore been little visited, and as it is infested with land crabs, the stay of the few parties which have been there has been short. But scientifically it is of interest, not only for the number of new species which may be obtained there, but also for the extraordinary attitude of wild seabirds towards human beings whom they have never learnt to fear. Before we left England, it had been decided to attempt a landing and spend a day there, if we should pass sufficiently near to it. Those who have visited it in the past include the astronomer Halley, who occupied it in 1700. Sir James Ross, outward bound for the Antarctic in 1839, spent a day there, landing in a small cove a short distance to the northward of the 9-pin rock of Halley, the surf on all other parts being too great to admit of it, without hazarding the destruction of our boats. Ross also writes that Horsburgh mentions that the island abounds with wild pig and goats. One of the latter was seen. With the view to add somewhat to the stock of useful creatures, a cock and 2 hens were put on shore. They seemed to enjoy the change, and, I have no doubt, in so unfrequented a situation and so delightful a climate, will quickly increase in numbers. I am afraid we did not find any of their descendants, nor those of the pig and goats. I doubt whether fowls would survive the land crabs very long. There are many wild birds on the island, however, which may feed the shipwrecked, and also a depot left by the government for that purpose. Another visitor was Knight, who wrote a book called The Cruise of the Falcon, concerning his efforts to discover the treasure which is said to have been left there. Scott also visited it in the Discovery in 1901, when a new petrel was found, which was afterwards called Australata wilsoni, after the same Uncle Bill, who was zoologist of both Scott's expeditions. And so it came about that on the evening of July 25th, we furled sail and lay 5 miles from South Trinidad, with all our preparations made for a very thorough search of this island of treasure. Everything was to be captured, alive or dead, animal, vegetable, or mineral. At 5:30 the next morning, we were steaming slowly towards what looked like a quite impregnable face of rock, with bare cliffs standing straight out of the water, which luckily for us was comparatively smooth. As we coasted to try and find a landing place, the sun was rising behind the island, which reaches to a height of 2,000 feet, and the jagged cliffs stood up finely against the rosy sky. We dropped our anchor to the south of the island, and a boat's crew left to prospect for a landing place, whilst Wilson seized the opportunity to shoot some birds as specimens, including 2 species of frigate bird, and the seamen caught some of the multitudinous fish. We also fired shots at the sharks, which soon thronged round the ship, and about which we were to think more before the day was done. The boat came back with the news that a possible landing place had been found, and the landing parties got off about 8:30. The landing was very bad. A ledge of rock weathered out of the cliff to our right formed, as it were, a staging along which it was possible to pass on to a steeply shelving talus slope in front of us. The sea being comparatively smooth, everybody was landed dry, with their guns and collecting gear. The best account of South Trinidad is contained in a letter written by Bowers to his mother, which is printed here. But some brief notes which I jotted down at the time may also be of interest, since they give an account of a different part of the island. Having made a small depot of cartridges, together with a little fluffy tern and a tern's egg, which Wilson found on the rocks, we climbed westward, round and up, to a point from which we could see into the East Bay. This was our first stand, and we shot several white-breasted petrel, Ostralata trinitatis, and also black-breasted petrel, Ostralata armingoniana. Later on, we got over the brow of a cliff where the petrel were nesting. We took 2 nests, on each of which a white-breasted and a black-breasted petrel were paired. Wilson caught one in his hands, and I caught another on its nest. It really did not know whether it ought to fly away or not. This gives rise to an interesting problem, since these 2 birds have been classified as different species, and it now looks as though they are the same. The gannets and terns were quite extraordinary, like all the living things there. If you stay still enough, the terns perch on your head. In any case, they will not fly off the rocks till you are 2 or 3 feet away. Several gannets were caught in the men's hands. All the fish which the biologist collected today can travel quite fast on land. When the discovery was here, Wilson saw a fish come out of the sea, seize a land crab about 18 inches away, and take it back into the water. The land crabs were all over the place in thousands. It seems probable that their chief enemies are themselves. They are regular cannibals. Then we did a real long climb northwards, over rocks and tufty grass till 1:30 p.m. From the point we had reached, we could see both sides of the island and the little Martin Voss Islands in the distance. We found lots of little tern and tern's eggs lying out on the bare rock with no nest at all. Hooper also brought us 2 little gannets, all fluffy, but even at this age larger than a rook. As we got further up, we began to come across the fossilized trees for which the island is well known. 4 or 5 Captain Biscuits made an excellent lunch, and afterwards we started to the real top of the island, a hill rising to the west of us. It was covered with a high scrubby bush and rocks, and was quite thick. In fact, there was more vegetation here than on all the rest we had seen, and in making our way through it, we had to keep calling in order to keep touch with one another. The tree ferns were numerous, but stunted. The gannets were sleeping on the tops of the bushes, and some of the crabs had climbed up the bushes and were sunning themselves on the top. These crabs were round us in thousands. I counted 7 watching me out of one crack between 2 rocks. We sat down under the lee of the summit and thought it would not be bad to be thrown away on a desert island, little thinking how near we were to being stranded, for a time at any rate. The crabs gathered round us in a circle, with their eyes turning towards us, as if they were waiting for us to die to come and eat us. One big fellow left his place in the circle and waddled up to my feet and examined my boots. First with one claw, and then with the other he took a taste of my boot. He went away obviously disgusted. One could almost see him shake his head. We collected, as well as our birds and eggs, some spiders, very large grasshoppers, woodlice, cockchafers, with big and small centipedes. In fact, the place teemed with insect life. I should add that their names are given rather from the general appearance of the animals than from their true scientific classes. We had a big and fast scramble down, and about halfway, when we could watch the sea breaking on the rocks far below, we saw that there was a bigger swell running. It was getting late, and we made our way down as fast as we could, denting our guns as we slipped on the rocks. The lower we got, the bigger the sea which had risen in our absence appeared to be. No doubt it was the swell of a big disturbance far away, and when we reached the debris slope where we had landed, flanked by big cliffs, we found everybody gathered there and the boats lying off, it being quite impossible for them to get near the shore. They had just got a lifeline ashore on a buoy. Bowers went out onto the rocks and secured it. We put our guns and specimens into a pile, out of reach, as we thought, of any possible sea. But just afterwards, 2 very large waves took us. We were hauling in the rope, and must have been a good 30 feet above the base of the wave. It hit us hard, and knocked us all over the place, and wetted the guns and specimens above us through and through. We then stowed all gear and specimens well out of the reach of the seas, and then went out through the surf one by one, passing ourselves out on the line. It was ticklish work, but Hooper was the only one who really had a bad time. He did not get far enough out among the rocks which fringed the steep slope from which he started, as a wave began to roll back. The next wave caught him and crashed him back, and he let go of the line. He was under quite a long time, and as the waves washed back, all that we could do was to try and get the line to him. Luckily, he succeeded in finding the slack of the line and got out. When we first got down to the shore and things were looking nasty, Wilson sat down on the top of a rock and ate a biscuit in the coolest possible manner. It was an example to avoid all panicking, for he did not want the biscuit. He remarked afterwards to me, apropos to Hooper, that it was a curious thing that a number of men, knowing that there was nothing they could do, could quietly watch a man fighting for his life, and he did not think that any but the British temperament could do so. I also found out later that he and I had both had a touch of cramp while waiting for our turn to swim out through the surf. The following is Bowers' letter. The past week has been so crowded with incident, really, that I don't know where to start. Getting to land made me long for the mails from you, which are such a feature of getting to port. However, the strange, uninhabited island which we visited will have to make up for my disappointment till we get to Cape Town, or rather Simonstown. Campbell and I sighted S. Trinidad from the foreyard arm on 25th, and on 26th at first thing in the morning, we crept up to an anchorage in a sea of glass. The S.E. trades, making a considerable sea, were beating on the eastern sides, while the western was like a mill pond. The great rocks and hills to over 2,000 feet towered above us as we went in very close in order to get our anchor down, as the water is very deep to quite a short distance from the shore. West Bay was our selection, and so clear was the water that we could see the anchor at the bottom in 15 fathoms. A number of sharks and other fish appeared at once, and several birds. Evans wanted to explore, so Oates, Rennick, Atkinson, and myself went away with him, pulling the boat. We examined the various landings and found them all rocky and dangerous. There was a slight surf, although the sea looked like a mill pond. We finally decided on a previously unused place, which was a little inlet among the rocks. There was nothing but rock, but there was a little nook where we decided to try and land. We returned to breakfast and found that Wilson and Cherry Garrard had shot several frigate and other birds from the ship, the little Norwegian boat, called a pram, being used to pick them up. By way of explanation, I may say that Wilson is a specialist in birds and is making a collection for the British Museum. We all landed as soon as possible, Wilson and Gerard with their guns for birds, Oates with the dogs, and Atkinson with a small rifle, Lily after plants and geological specimens, Nelson and Simpson along the shore after sea beasts, etc. And last but not least came the entomological party, under yours truly, with Wright and later Evans as assistants. Pennell joined up with Wilson, so altogether we were ready to do the island. I have taken over the collection of insects for the expedition, as the other scientists all have so much to do that they were only too glad to shove the small beasts on me. Atkinson is a specialist in parasites. It is called helminthology. I never heard that name before. He turns out the interior of every beast that is killed, and being also a surgeon, I suppose the subject must be interesting. White terns abounded on the island. They were ghost-like and so tame that they would sit on one's hat. They laid their eggs on pinnacles of rock without a vestige of nest, and singly. They looked just like stones. I suppose this was a protection from the land crabs, about which you will have heard. The land crabs of Trinidad are a byword, and they certainly deserve the name, as they abound from sea level to the top of the island. The higher up, the bigger they were. The surface of the hills and valleys was covered with loose boulders, and the whole island being of volcanic origin. Coarse grass is everywhere, and at about 1,500 feet is an area of tree ferns and subtropical vegetation, extending up to nearly the highest parts. The withered trees of a former forest are everywhere, and their existence unexplained, though Lily had many ingenious theories. The island has been in our hands, the Germans, and is now Brazilian. Nobody has been able to settle there permanently, owing to the land crabs. These also exclude mammal life. Captain Kidd made a treasure depot there, and some 5 years ago, a chap named Knight lived on the island for 6 months with a party of Newcastle miners trying to get at it. He had the place all right, but a huge landslide has covered up 750,000 of the pirates' gold. The land crabs are little short of a nightmare. They peep out at you from every nook and boulder. Their dead, staring eyes follow your every step as if to say, "If only you will drop down, we will do the rest." To lie down and sleep on any part of the island would be suicidal. Of course, Knight had a specially cleared place with all sorts of precautions. Otherwise, he would never have survived these beasts, which even tried to nibble your boots as you stood, staring hard at you the whole time. One feature that would soon send a lonely man off his chump is that no matter how many are in sight, they are all looking at you, and they follow step by step with a sickly deliberation. They are all yellow and pink, and next to spiders seem the most loathsome creatures on God's earth. Talking about spiders, Bowers always had the greatest horror of spiders. I have to collect them as well as insects. Needless to say, I caught them with a butterfly net and never touched one. Only 5 species were known before, and I found 15 or more. At any rate, I have 15 for certain. Others helped me to catch them, of course. Another interesting item to science is the fact that I caught a moth hitherto unknown to exist on the island, also various flies, ants, etc. Altogether, it was a most successful day. Wilson got dozens of birds and lily plants, etc. On our return to the landing place, we found to our horror that a southerly swell was rolling in, and great breakers were bursting on the beach. About 5 p.m., we all collected and looked at the whaler and pram on one side of the rollers and ourselves on the other. First, it was impossible to take off the guns and specimens, so we made them all up to leave for the morrow. Second, a sick man had come ashore for exercise, and he could not be got off. Finally, Atkinson stayed ashore with him. The breakers made the most awe-inspiring cauldron in our little nook, and it meant a tough swim for all of us. 3 of us swam out first and took a line to the pram, and finally we got a good rope from the whaler, which had anchored well out to the shore. I then maneuvered the pram, and everybody plunged into the surf and hauled himself out with the rope, all well, but minus our belongings, and got back to the ship. Very wet and ravenous was a mild way to put it. During my 12 to 4 watch that night, the surf roared like thunder, and the ship herself was rolling like anything, and looked horribly close to the shore. Of course she was quite safe, really. It transpired that Atkinson and the seamen had a horrible night with saltwater-soaked food, and the crabs and white terns which sat and watched them all night, squawking in chorus whenever they moved. It must have been horrible, though I would like to have stayed, and had I known anybody was staying would have volunteered. This, with the noise of the surf and the cold, made it pretty rotten for them. In the morning, Evans, Rennick, Oates, and I, with 2 seamen and Gran, took the whaler and pram in to rescue the maroons. At first, we thought we would do it by a rocket line to the end of the sheer cliff. The impossibility of such an idea was at once evident, so Gran and I went in close in the pram and hove them lines to get off the gear first. I found the spoon-shaped pram a wonderful boat to handle. You could go in to the very edge of the breaking surf, lifted like a cork on top of the waves, and as long as you kept head to sea and kept your own head, you need never have got on the rocks, as the tremendous backswish took you out like a shot every time. It was quite exciting, however, as we would slip in close in a lull, and the chaps in the whaler would yell, "Look out," if a big wave passed them, in which case you would pull out for dear life. Our first lines carried away, and then, with others, Rennick and I this time took the pram, while Atkinson got as near the edge as safe to throw us the gear. I was pulling, and by watching our chances, we rescued the cameras and glasses, once being carried over 12 feet above the rocks, and only escaping by the backswish. Then the luckiest incident of the day occurred, when in a lull we got our sick man down, and I jumped out, and he in, as I steadied the boat's stern. The next minute the boat flew out on the backwash with the seamen absolutely dry, and I was of course enveloped in foam and blackness 2 seconds later by a following wave. Twice the day before this had happened, but this time for a moment I thought, where will my head strike? As I was like a feather in a breeze in that swirl. When I banked it was about 15 feet above, and very scratched and winded, I clung on with my nails and scrambled up higher. The next wave, a bigger one, nearly had me, but I was just too high to be sucked back. Atkinson and I then started getting the gear down, Evans having taken my place in the pram. By running down between waves, we hove some items into the boat, including the guns and rifles, which I went right down to throw. These were caught and put into the boat, but Evans was too keen to save a bunch of boots that Atkinson threw down, and the next minute the pram passed over my head and landed high and dry, like a bridge, over the rocks between which I was wedged. I then scrambled out as the next wave washed her still higher, right over and over, with Evans and Rennick just out in time. The next wave, a huge one, picked her up, and out she bumped over the rocks and out to sea she went, waterlogged, with the guns, fortunately, jammed under the thwarts. She was rescued by the whaler, bailed out, and then Gran and one of the seamen manned her battered remains again, and we, unable to save the gear otherwise, lashed it to life buoys, threw it into the sea, and let it drift out with the backwash to be picked up by the pram. Clothes, watches and ancient guns, rifles, ammunition, birds, dead, and all specimens were, with the basket of crockery and food, soaked with salt water. However, the choice was between that or leaving them all together, as anybody would have said had they seen the huge rollers breaking among the rocks and washing 30 to 40 feet up with the spray. In fact, we were often knocked over and submerged for a time, clinging hard to some rock or one of the ropes for dear life. Evans swam off first. Then I was about half an hour trying to rescue a hawser and some lines entangled among the rocks. It was an amusing job. I would wait for a lull, run down and haul away, staying under for smaller waves and running up the rocks like a hare when the warning came from the boat that a series of big ones were coming in. I finally rescued most of it, had to cut off some, and got it to the place opposite the boat, and with rennet secured it and sent it out to sea to be picked up. My pair of brown tennis shoes, old ones, had been washed off my feet in one of the scrambles, so I was wearing a pair of sea boots, Nelson's I found, which, fortunately for him, was one of the few pairs saved. The pram came in, and waiting for a backwash, rennet swam off. I ran down after the following wave, and securing my green hat, which by the by is a most useful asset, struck out through the boiling and grabbed the pram safely as we were lifted on the crest of an immense roller. However, we were just beyond its breaking point, so all was well, and we arrived aboard after 8 hours wash and wetness, and none the worse, except for a few scratches, and yours truly in high spirits. We stayed there that night, and the following, Thursday morning left. Winds are not too favorable so far, as we dropped the SE trades almost immediately, and these are the variables between the trades and the westerlies. Still 2,500 miles off our destination. Evans has therefore decided to steer straight for Simonstown and miss out the other islands. It is a pity, but as it is winter down here and the worst month of the year for storms at Tristan da Cunha, it is perhaps just as well. I am longing to get to the Cape to have your letters and hear all about you. Except for the absence of news, life aboard is much to be desired. I simply love it and enjoy every day of my existence here. Time flies like anything, and though it must have been long to you, to us it goes like the wind, so different to that fortnight on the passage home from India. After the return of the boat's crew, we left South Trinidad, and the zoologists had a busy time trying to save as many as possible of the bird skins which had been procured. They skinned on all through the following night, and considering that the birds had been lying out in the tropics for 24 hours, soaked with seawater, and had been finally capsized in the overturned boat, the result was not so disappointing as was expected. But the eggs and many other articles were lost. Since the black-breasted and white-breasted petrels were seen flying and nesting paired together, it is reasonable to suppose that their former classification as two separate species will have to be revised. Soon after leaving South Trinidad, we picked up our first big, long swell, logged at 8, and began to learn that the Terra Nova can roll as few ships can. This was followed by a stiff gale on our port beam, and we took over our first green seas. Bowers wrote home as follows: "All chances of going to Tristan are over, and we are at last booming along with strong westerlies, with the enormous southern rollers lifting us like a cork on their crests. We have had a stiff gale and a very high sea, which is now over, though it is still blowing a moderate gale, and the usual crowd of albatross, mollymawks, Cape hens, Cape pigeons, etc., are following us. These will be our companions down to the south. Wilson's idea is that, as the prevailing winds round the 40s are westerlies, these birds simply fly round and round the world, via Cape Horn, New Zealand, and the Cape of Good Hope. We have had a really good opportunity now of testing the ship's behavior, having been becalmed with a huge beam swell rolling 35 degrees each way, and having stood out a heavy gale with a high sea. In both she has turned up trumps, and really I think a better little sea-boat never floated, compared to the Loch Torridon, which was always awash in bad weather. We are as dry as a cork, and never once shipped a really heavy sea. Of course a wooden ship has some buoyancy of herself, and we are no exception. We are certainly an exception for general seaworthiness, if not for speed, and a safer, sounder ship there could not be. The weather is now cool too. Cold, some people call it. I am still comfortable in cotton shirts and whites, while some are wearing Shetland gear. Nearly everybody is provided with Shetland things. I am glad you have marked mine, as they are all so much alike. I am certainly as well provided with private gear as anybody, and far better than most, so, being as well a generator of heat in myself, I should be okay in any temperature. By the by, Evans and Wilson are very keen on my being in the western party, while Campbell wants me with him in the eastern party. I have not asked to go ashore, but am keen on anything and am ready to do anything. In fact, there is so much going on that I feel I should like to be in all three places at once, east, west, and ship.